Opportunity to contribute to this important debate, and I want to thank my colleague Deputy O'Keefe for affording his time to debate this issue. I listened with interest to some of the contributions from backbenchers on the other side, and they sought to give us a history lesson in Fianna Fáil's performance in the Department of Agriculture over the last decade and beyond. And I think it's a pity when we get down to that level of tardiness in an important debate like this, because that gives a lie to the recognition that there's a very significant crisis in the agricultural sector. And whilst it might appear like point scoring or answering the question like you would in a college debate, it falls well short of what the farming community expect from all of us in here. And I think what Deputy O'Keefe has done by putting down what I believe to be a balanced motion with a solution attached deserves to get due recognition and considered debate by all sides. And I would hope that the Minister will engage constructively, as I expect he will, in that debate. I don't want to go back on issues in relation to agriculture, but the previous Minister, Brendan Smith, set a very ambitious target for the production output of the agricultural sector in this country, namely Harvest 2020. They were ambitious targets, and they required successive governments to continue his efforts to ensure that we reach that output. And it's not just about output, because to have an output, you need to have a sector that can get a fair day's pay for a fair level of work. And that's not happening in the beef sector. It hasn't been happening for some time, and now it has reached a crisis level. And I don't want to be overly negative, Minister, but the farming community don't believe that you're addressing it adequately or appropriately or in a manner that will assist them to make an honest living. It is the case that farmers are taking €3.60 per kilo for beef here at the moment, whilst at the same time farmers for corresponding R-grade beef steers in the UK will get €4.60 a kilo. On a standard carcass of 350 kilos, that amounts to a price differential of €350. Now, in anyone's mind, Minister, that differential is phenomenal and is not acceptable when you consider that the retailers are charging effectively the same price on the shelf for Irish and British beef. And when you further take into consideration that a half of all of our beef output is sold in the UK, it is very clear to anybody doing the analysis that the impact has the potential to be detrimental to this particular sector, one which both the previous and this government have penned and tagged so much on in terms of improving our employment prospects and generating an increased level of growth in our fragile economy. And the view is, Minister, that even in the last number of months, the gap has widened and the price in the UK taken by UK farmers has gone up about 30 cents more. That's another €100 per head. That's not sustainable. It's not sustainable from an Irish farmer's point of view, as I said, when you're considering that the beef is being sold at the same price. So the issue is there's no transparency. Now, we have a view that you need a beef regulator to deal with this. Others have other ideas around it. But at the end of the day, Minister, there's an expectation that you can do more. Now, I've heard your comments, and I share some of your concerns about your inability effectively in an unregulated sector that's regulated by the markets for you to get yourself directly involved. And I have some recognition of your difficulties there. But there are other issues. There's this issue around where the processing sector have sought to change the specifications at the same time as the supermarkets and McDonald's, being big users of beef, saying that they haven't changed their specification. They don't expect anything different. And you and I, Minister, know full well why the specification has been changed. It's because the industry, or the attempt to change the specification, is because the industry see an oversupply of stock. And that resulted from the lack of export of the Frisian bulls from the dairy herd in 2012, and the impact that that has been having in depressing the market because of the oversupply. But if you take that through to its logical conclusion, Minister, and you look to 2015 with the ending of the dairy quotas, I haven't heard anything from you or your department in terms of developing a strategy to deal with the increased production of the bull calves in that instance, and the potential for a further destruction of the market into 2016 and 17 and beyond. Now, that's welcome, and we need to hear that. But more than I need to hear it, the farmers who are struggling at the moment, who are wondering if they'll sell off their cows, and which will have a further impact on our capacity to produce the levels of beef as set out in 2020. But if the suckler cow is sold and farmers decide to either move into some other enterprise or move away from farming altogether, then you have an even worse crisis on your hand. I mean, the dairy sector has always taken the view that they'd manage it on a 5-year basis. And if there's a trough this year, they look towards peaks next year because they look to the world market. Well, the beef farmer can't do it. I know a little bit about this because the county that I represent is probably one of the premier counties for the suckler herd. And I'm talking to farmers on a regular basis who see no future in beef. They don't see a future, or they don't see a strategy from this government. And therefore, many of them feel that the only alternative is to dispose the suckler cow and move on with their lives, or discourage their son or daughter from taking over that suckler herd. So that has a real potential to be an interruption, if you want, or a shock to the projected targets that were set out in Harvest 2020. And I think, Minister, it will require some level of intervention. And the proposal by Deputy O'Keefe in relation to a €200 per head on the beef genomics is one such measure that will help to improve the output of the beef produced, and therefore guarantee, insofar as you can, an appropriate level of return to the farmers. As I said, the issue that arose in 2012 of the retention of the Frisian bull effectively for beef here hasn't materialised last year, and therefore obviously we will see some improvement. But there is deep concern, as I said, about what's going to happen into the future. Now, so I think you have to tackle the factories. I think you have to tackle the supermarkets. We don't see the kind of transparency in the way in which they report their profits, or the way in which they succeed in doing one thing in the UK, they do something completely different here. But the farmer here is taking all the pain, is suffering to the greatest extent. When you consider that you have effectively the same set of producers, you've almost the same set of supermarkets, but yet there's 100 miles at a certain point, less if you take in the northern part of England, between our two islands. We largely produce the same quality. I would argue to a much better quality here. So I think there's a role for you, Minister. I think you've got to involve yourself with the factories. I think you've got to force them to deal with it. I also think that you need to look to competition in the sector. And I don't mean competition within the processing sector. Competition between live exports and beef production and beef processing. And I know you have been making considerable efforts to improve the overseas market. And you've talked about the United States as being a potential source of output, or a source of a market for us. But best will in the world, a couple of thousand tonnes is all that's going to go to the US. Now, I know you've been there. You're heading off to China again. You were there a year and a half ago. There hasn't been an ounce of beef sold to China yet. Now, look, I accept a relationship with the Chinese market takes time to build, and I wish you well with that. Yeah, and I wish you well with that. But notwithstanding that, the nearest market which needs resolution is the live export trade into the north of Ireland. And in my view, you have. But Minister, when you consider you can give the facts as you do, but it's still hiding the reality that with the supply of beef that's here and the depressed level of pricing that the farmers are taking, they're unable to make a living. They're losing money. They're losing the will to continue to farm. And that's heartbreaking for all of us. And I'm not saying, don't misunderstand me. I'm not laying all this on your door. I'm not going to do what some of your backbenchers seek to do, to overly politicise this. But there is a requirement for you to involve yourself, I think, more aggressively in targeting the processors and the supermarkets, and working more towards finding an alternative source an alternate market source, namely the live export trade. And I think if you can, and I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily easy, but I think if the farmers saw you working more constructively in that regard, rather than sitting on a jet and heading to China again with the industry, they might have more faith in you, and they might have more faith in the market to be able to tolerate an increase in production and tolerate and deliver to them a price that makes their holdings, their livelihoods, sustainable into the future.
Thank you very much.